I'd like to welcome you all to this self-portrait workshop. It takes place as part of our wider Reflecting Ourselves exhibition of disabled women's self-portraits, which we're holding for the very first time, but possibly not the last, for March for International Women's Month. So there's also a workshop with Nancy Willis next Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. on Zoom. The reason we're scheduling these sessions on a Friday afternoon is that if you're inspired to go and create new work, we hope you have a bit more time at the weekend to do that. So thank you for joining us. What I've decided to do in terms of making this as accessible as possible for deaf people is I'm going to introduce the work that I'm going to show before I screen share it. When I screen share it, I'm just going to audio describe it, and then I'm going to take the screen share down again when I'm talking. I'm very pleased to have with us Alice, our very own Alison Marchant, club's programme leader, but also well-known international installation artist and feminist artist. So Alison's going to join in and ask me some questions, and we're also going to take questions and points from the chat. We've called it a workshop rather than a talk because I hope it's going to be informal and you're going to be able to interact more than with a talk. But also, this is the first time that I've presented this work and looked back at it. So it's going to be sort of workshopping it for me too. So apologies if I don't pre-script, which I haven't today. I do tend to stop and start a bit because I've got a communication impairment. But I hope that being so informal will also get something different out of it. So I'd like to start by presenting the very first self-portraits that I ever did, which I now claim probably very accurately to be the first selfie series on the internet. They date back to 1997. And I took these portraits when I was working at Falmouth College of Arts, part-time, well, hourly paid lecturer, really, when I was finishing my PhD and living in Cornwall. So I was able to hire the photo studio. And the photos, I decided I would take these photographs. So sorry, this information is in no particular order, but I decided I would take these photographs between two mirrors. And that was very much in response to something that's still true more than 25 years later, which is we don't see images of disabled women. And I felt that if I was going to be reflecting myself, the only way I could, if you like, populate the internet with these different images was to stand between these mirrors. And I remember going to buy the mirrors. And of course, I was a student myself. I didn't really have any money. So the mirrors were very, very thin. So standing between them, leaning on my stick, and the mirrors were flexing away, I remember being quite alarming. And I also remember that the lights that we had to be switched on and off. They were photo lights, so you couldn't leave them on. And they would start smoking. So I would take one shot and then I would have to switch the lights off again until they stopped smoking. Some of you may if you were making any kind of photographic work with early digital photography in the 1990s, you might recognize this. But I found it all quite a challenging experience. I'd never created a self-portrait before, and I hadn't really ever been photographed much. I associated that kind of attention with abuse. I didn't think I was photogenic. But at the time, I'd been prescribed a spinal brace, which will you see in the images? No, I don't think you will see in the images. But it's like a plastic corset. They put you into a plaster cast, make a whole plaster cast of your body from your neck down to the bottom of your hips. And then they cast a plastic brace, which some people have to sleep in. I didn't. But you wear all of the time to stop your spine from moving. It's most often prescribed to young people with kyphosis and scoliosis to alter the way their spine's growing or to prevent the curvature from developing until they can have surgery. And one of the things looking back is that these braces always came in horrible pink plastic. And today they don't. And this piece of work, My Not So Secret Life as a Cyborg, actually got a huge amount of attention in the late 90s, including from the medical world. So I don't know how much of a role it played in the fact that when our goddaughter, the young actor Eve Smith, went into a brace, which I think was the early 20 teens, she had a choice of really attractive plastic, but I did not. And although I was somebody who always wore very baggy clothes, and I think, again, looking back, I wasn't comfortable with my body, they still weren't baggy enough to fit over this wretched brace. So I had two choices, really. I could go and buy tent-like garments and completely hide my body, or probably for the first time in my life, I could expose it by wearing tight clothes underneath and just sticking the brace on top. And I had a friend who was a costume designer, and she helped paint the brace and decorate the brace so that it reflected my life in all sorts of different ways. Like I said, I'm not going to show you, I haven't got an image of that particular brace lined up. However, it is on the My Not So Secret Life as a Cyborg website, which is linked from the webpage about the Reflecting Ourselves exhibition. So you can find it very easily afterwards and have a look for yourself. It's not a self-portrait kind of, which is why it's kind of a bit tangential. But we decorated this brace in silver. We had a shattered CD on the back. It had dolphins, crystals, shells. And I was effectively found myself doing disability as performance art. And that was how I described it. And I knew that people would want to photograph me. So I decided I wanted to take the photographs first. So thus the session, I think sort of Easter holidays 1997, Falmouth College of Art, with these kind of wibbly wobbly mirrors and these smoking lights. And what I was able to use to take the photographs was one of the very first digital cameras, which again I sort of signed out from the university, which was the only reason I had access to it. And with this camera, I don't know, I think the sort of the idea of twin cameras on phones was not even a twinkle in somebody's eye. But what you did have was, I think it was a little Fuji, was a movable, can't remember the word, but display. So you could turn the display round and use it like a mirror, and then so the lens was facing outwards, photographing myself in the mirror. And but I could see myself, I could see what was happening on the display that I was holding. So I created these series of images, and I think there's 4 or 5 of them that I'm going to show you to start with. The first one is the sort of the strongest image, which was the image that I really used as my self-portrait and also put onto a little laminated business card. The next image is a mirror image of that picture. I've reversed it in Photoshop or something similar. I think it was Photoshop even then. And I did that because I already wanted to show that the way we're reflected as disabled women in society is distorted. And then I did another couple of shots, apparently using the camera like a mirror. So I'm just going to try and share those before I get to the end of this, and then I'll come back before we go to the end of that series. So this is an image, not so different from me now, but it's a woman with short, very short red-brown hair. And half of the face is obscured vertically. So you can see half of my nose, half of my mouth, one ear, one eye, and the rest is covered by the camera. I've got a black top on, and from what I recall, you can't see it all in the image, but from what I recall, it was a long-sleeved, tight black t-shirt, which had a silver barcode across the front. And this was very much linked to my feeling like a cyborg. I've got silver rings on my fingers, and my fingers are quite prominent at the front of the image because they're holding the camera. And although it doesn't work in quite the way that I had aimed to make it work, which I think is something we'll come back to, you can sort of see on the left hand side the distortions of the mirrors. These aren't the best quality, but I suspect because this is over 25 years ago, that this is probably as high a quality as the camera actually produced. So this is where it's been reversed. So I'm discussing on the website, how people perceive me, how things are distorted again. But it's literally the same image, but just flipped around, flip horizontal, as we would say now. And then this third image is one of the images where I'm using it like a mirror. So it's the first time that you can see the whole of my face, but it's also a more gentle picture. It's when we look straight at the camera or we're pictured painted looking straight out of the frame, it's quite an authoritative pose. In the old days, we used to say in terms of video, you should only use that for newscasters, politicians. It's all about authority. So this is very different. This is me reflecting on myself, sort of looking at myself, if you like, in the mirror. And you can just see a bit of purple light. And again, I think when I was creating the lighting, in addition to these, what are they called, red eye burning lights, I also had some UV. So the UV was there to sort of make it all glow a bit more, and occasionally you can see that in the purple. And then I think this is the last of those, which is, so it's closer up. So I'm still looking in the phone as if it's a camera, but it's closer up. And you can see the rings on my hand again, and also some sort of silvery bracelet. You've got the light of the UV light you can see again, and you can also see the back of my head reflected in the mirror. So again, it's that sense of being trapped between the mirrors. Now I'm going to come back to this next photograph. When I was producing this, it was the first piece of what I would describe as disability art, but it was also, sorry, I just got distracted by Alison switching her camera back on. I'm really sorry about that, Alison. So it was my first piece of disability art, but it was also one of my first websites. And one of the jobs I had as an hourly paid teacher at Falmouth was to teach web design, which was not a happy experience because they just assumed that the man who'd been teaching it before knew more than me, which was completely the opposite. But still, I don't recall it as being a particularly happy experience. And I also, for an art school in particular, found the atmosphere to me wearing the brace very hostile. But of course, I had no choice. I had the choice of covering myself up and walking around like a tent. But that wasn't the choice that I made. So I was a very visible member of staff in an art school, and the other staff members found it very uncomfortable. So I wanted to find a way of explaining to the students why I looked the way I looked and how that related to who I was. Partly just to show them how to create web pages. And of course, we look back now, it's 1997, it's nearly 30 years old. You can tell that from the design. But I've deliberately not updated it because I thought it was important to leave it as it was. So the site developed. It wasn't here is a piece, take it or leave it. As the summer went on, 1997, I was adding to it. But also when I came back to London in 1997, 98, I continued to add to it. So I'm just going to show you in a minute a photograph that I took with a friend of mine, and he'd created this shirt. I think, yes, let me just show you and I'll come back to it. So to audio describe this piece, it's me standing, leaning on the same stick, shot from behind in a very oversized, because it wasn't originally made for me, black shirt that has down the back and the spine, it says no backbone. And he's painted that on in lettering that's quite hard to read, but looks just like a spine. And it was also an opportunity for me to discuss within the work the way that we're seen as having defective personalities. You know, if you're disabled, you've just got no backbone. You know, pull yourself together, everything's going to be fine. So that was why I decided that I would take a shot in that photograph. And I think it's on a page called Cyborg Life Today, which was the sort of update from, you know, here I was at the beginning at Falmouth and here I was in London. But having done all of that, I thought I was making a website about the brace. And I think this is something that as artists, we often find we think we're doing one thing, but it's only later when we look at it or when critics look at it that we realize that there's more layers to the work. And I realized that, of course, I'd been making a website about my body, but I hadn't shown my body. I'd shown my brace, I'd shown me dressed up as a cyborg. So I decided that I would do effectively a nude photograph that would show my body but would also disguise it at the same time. And the idea that I had was that if you took the clothes off, I really was a cyborg. So I had a very long session with shiny green body paint. And yes, it's left me determined never to do that again, even all these years later. And then I was photographed in the body paint. So I'm just going to show you that and audio describe it. So in this picture, again, I've used mirrors. So I'm reaching out, cuddling. You can't quite see him there, but who's my lovely long-haired grey and white cat, Mr. Jiffy. And again, you know, this was actually shot on proper film, I say, but color transparency. So it is possible to create a much better image of this. But you can just see in the background, even on this digital image, the braces standing there, the boots, because I always used to wear very heavy silver boots and they feature in it. So the boots are there, the brace is there, and you can see my spine reflected in the mirror. And the friend who helped paint me and also pushed the button for me then picked out my spine in silver. And that's why the spine really comes through. And I really liked the contrast between that and the image that said no backbone. So that was, I think, in terms of time, Alison, what we'll do is we'll chat about it all at the end. So that was my first piece of disability art, my first self-portraits, and yes, the first selfie series on the internet. You know, you just dread to think, don't you? Kind of not necessarily what I want to be remembered for, but it did introduce me to the world of disability art. And the next piece I want to show you comes from, I think, about 5 or 6 years later. And it was my very first funded piece of work, as well as, no, maybe it wasn't my first funded piece of work, but it was definitely my first funded self-portrait. And it's a series. It's a series called Perception 1 to 4. And after Matisse, Backs 1 to 4. Although in French, the original, they're called Nudes 1 to 4. And yes, I took my clothes off again, which is something I in my 20s I would never have done. You know, by this point I was in my 30s, which I kind of feel is a bit different, or it was for me. So I'd been very ill. Tate Modern had opened. A friend had given me a year's membership. I'd gone to Tate Modern. I'd seen the Matisse backs on display. And they're, for anybody who doesn't know them, they're 4 relief bronzes. Um, and I just really responded to them. The way Matisse made it is he did a plaster cast. And then he cast it in bronze. And then he went back to the cast. And I can't remember if he sort of added more plaster or quite what he did to the casting, but effectively the casting changes each time. So you've got this series of four pieces, which are all the same woman, shot from behind with long hair. But the shape sort of subtly changes. And by the time you get to number four, it's yes, it's got much less detail than number one. And Tate were very helpful. They allowed me to go in after it was closed and take lots and lots of close-up photographs, which was really essential. And yes, so that was all very useful. What I decided was that actually digital art and casting are very, very similar, because in casting you can create more than one original, and with digital art you can create more than one original. And casting is always seen as slightly kind of less important as a result, and I suspect the same is true of digital. Um, but we shall see as the future progresses. But it really appealed to me. But the other thing that I was very interested in was being both the artist and the model. So this is perhaps, as well as disability, this was very much about gender, like a lot of my work. And it was about saying, well, the artist is always male, the model is always female, and the model is almost always nude. And I think it was the Guerrilla Girls sort of showed, the vast majority of images in art museums of women, the women tended to be nude. So I thought how interesting to play with that power by being both the artist and the model. So what I'm going to do is just screen share again. So like I say, this was about 1998. And then this is Perception 1, which I'm pretty sure I made in 2003. And here I'm very much trying to take exactly the same position as Matisse's original model. And it's quite naturalistic. The light box, they're light box images. So the light boxes are 2 meters high by 1 meter wide. And the image behind is sort of yellow and red. It's quite fiery. In fact, that's a close up of part of my skin, I think, towards the base of my spine that's been blown up and used for background. And then Perception 2, the colours have changed in the image to blues and greens, and I think it looks much more bronzy. Part of my funding was to explore Photoshop, to play with Photoshop. And I think anybody who can kind of remember sort of early filters and things, I tend not just to use, with all my digital manipulation, I tend to sort of do a lot of it freestyle. I don't tend to use a lot of standard filters, but I do bring them in. And then here we get to Perception 3. And this is where it goes blue. And again, it's that same thing. The background is always the skin, but it looks completely different depending on how it's been filtered and treated. And at this point, the stick it's been like I'm holding a beam of light. I'm not just leaning on a wall. There's this beam of light that I'm holding. The colours were really chosen because of chakra colours. They end up looking like a rainbow, but that's not where I was taking the colours from. And then this one finally, which is, as with Matisse, very much the least realistic. So the body shape is now pinks and purples, and I think the filter was supposed to look, I think I treated it to make it look more like I was a sort of silvery form. It certainly doesn't look like flesh. If I take it back, that is a very naturalistic image with the reds and the yellows. With the greens, it becomes much more like it's made of bronze. With the blue and the white, I think it's becoming more like I'm not quite vanishing, but I'm almost lit up from inside. And then in this last one, like I say, it's very silvery, very purpley. So that was perception 1 to 4. Let me just double check on my trusty iPad, which is next. So then I come on to some work that was funded by Wellcome Trust, and that was made in about 2007, 2008. Thank you for the comments in the chat, by the way. I'll come back to that. So just because I have problems concentrating as it is. So yes, in 2007, I became artist in residence part-time because I always do that for my energy levels. So at the National Institute of Medical Research. And that was when I went in to explore the idea of that how is how how does science kind of create our ideas of normality, and how much is science actually manipulated by the media and society. So I developed in this residency over 18 months what I describe as the scientific model of disability, which again is very much there on the links from the workshop page, so you can have a look at that in your own time if you're interested. But I produced an exhibition for their gallery as part of the residency, and then was lucky enough that Wellcome Trust agreed to fund a sort of 2 or 3 year national tour of the show. So I took the show, well, it went to Edinburgh, it went to Wales, it went to Belfast, it went to different places in England. Some of it went to Australia, some of it went to America. So it was well shown, but it was called abnormal. And within the scientific model of disability, what I really bring it down to is science is manipulated very much by the media and by popular culture so that we think what's normal, which is disability, is abnormal, and what's abnormal is normal. So you have this complete reversal. And so it's very multi-layered. I won't begin to scratch the surface today. But the self-portrait that became the exhibition image is known as Abnormal 1. And I'm just going to show you an audio, describe it, and then come back. So in this image, I'm wearing I'm basically kind of not many clothes on again, white bra top, like a little vest top, and white briefs. And I'm wearing a mask, which is a fox mask. And everything's in profile. So I'm standing there in profile, so you can really see my spinal curvature. Sorry, I should have said I've got very short dark red hair in all of these self-portraits. The one thing that doesn't change is my haircut. The mask has a wide white elastic band going around the back of my face, and you can see my fox tattoo on my left shoulder. So I've got the tattoo of a fox's head on my left shoulder. I've got the mask of a fox. The white band that goes around the back of my head, though, is more like the sort of continuation of a blindfold. And then typed at the bottom in sort of American, well, it looks like typewriter fonts. It's not really typed, but it just says abnormal in black. And then behind the figure, it's not necessarily very easy to see on the screen, but there's a shadow, and it's quite a monstrous shadow. It's almost because the shape of the mask is creating almost like a kind of, I don't know, it's not a human shadow. And the reason I made this piece, and I think it's still so important, is I hadn't realised until I did the residency the links between medicine photography, the medical model of disability, and the history of photography. So photography was very enthusiastically taken up by the Victorians in order to classify disabled people. So you took the point was you took photographs of anybody you considered to be abnormal, and then you categorized them, you sort of labeled them, you decided why they were abnormal, why they were defective. And you use those as references to train other scientists and doctors. So it was very, very tightly tied up with the history of photography. And it continued and probably still does. But at the point when I was doing the research, medical libraries or medical photo libraries were just going online. And what I discovered, unsurprisingly, given the experience of myself and my peers, is that disabled children in particular had very commonly, every time they had a regular appointment with the doctor, they would be stripped either down to their underwear or completely and photographed, obviously without any real consent, certainly without informed consent. And this was seen as critical record keeping, that photography was absolutely critical to monitoring your condition. And these huge numbers of these photos have just ended up in medical photo libraries, which were now available online, which I still consider to be, wrong, without using other vocabulary, just absolutely wrong. And the fact that, most people wouldn't even remember having those photos taken. It would never occur to them that those photographs were available online. So I was really trying to restage one of the modern photographs, but subvert it at the same time. And I was thinking about this because I haven't really reflected on my self-portrait practice before in this way. That a lot of, I think, certainly for disabled women, I think a lot of the motivation for self-portraits is about taking back control. It's about controlling our image in a way that only we can. And we may be losing control of it through medical photography. It may be that strangers are taking our photographs in the street. Photographing ourselves, I think, is very, it's like taking the position of the artist and the model. It is a position of power and about trying to empower ourselves as best we can. So I'm just going to go back to abnormal one. So this is abnormal two. I've deliberately repeated the abnormal within the exhibition, and it is deliberately very difficult to read. I will explain why when you can actually see Chris properly. But it says sex female, hair brown, eyes green, skin olive, height 170 centimeters, feet size 6, build slim, sexual orientation lesbian, and etc., etc., etc. And that was an early piece about DNA. And I don't know how many people remember, but sort of in the 20 noughties, there was a lot of discussion about whether there was a gay gene, for example. And of course, now we know that genetics is much, much more complicated than that. But I did a course for artists at Guy's Medical School. There was an Australian arts organisation who developed this course for artists on, I suppose, effectively genetic medicine, which I was fortunate enough to be invited to. And that was how I'd been introduced to the National Institute of Medical Research. So I was very interested in what was coded in our DNA, but also this idea that, well, if which of course is very much an ongoing issue today, if our DNA can be tested before birth, it's very likely, I don't know. I think I felt this sort of summed me up in the way that other people would sort of describe all these qualities, and they were also qualities that wouldn't be seen as all desirable. That if there was going to be any gene editing done, it would have been done. And so I kind of throw that in there partly because within reflecting ourselves, people have been saying to me, does it have to be a traditional self-portrait? And the answer is no. Quite simply, no, it does not. But I'm just going to show you one more image from that exhibition, which is called Please Do Not Touch the Artwork. And what was happening as I toured the abnormal exhibition is I would keep adding work. I think for me, it was really important that as a living exhibition, it also responded to the places that it went and it developed. It wasn't just static over 2 years. And without going into sort of huge detail, I also increased the number of giveaways because I've always liked to give away something when I've had a show. If it's just an image of, yeah, postcards, business cards, anything that has an image from the exhibition on, so that people can take away something without having to pay for it. And within the abnormal exhibition, that included ultimately a mirror that said normal, a badge that said abnormal, and various other things. And most of the tour went very well until it went to Newcastle and the Centre for Life. And we spent, I had some wonderful volunteers from Arcadia, which used to be the Northeast Disability Arts Forum. We had a very intense weekend hanging the show. And I went home on the Monday, and on the Tuesday, I got a call to say the show had been taken down because it was considered to be offensive. And I think particularly, yes, it was a science-based institution and they just found it too challenging, effectively. And I think in the past, I would have thought that was quite cool. And actually, it was devastating. Emotionally, it was really very, very difficult. So the next place it went to was Wales, I think Milford Haven. And I was staying with a friend, so I actually shot this piece sitting on his windowsill outside of his house. Um, but I think, like so many of us, you try to make sure that it doesn't quite look like that. It's just called Please Do Not Touch the Artwork. And it's just me holding up a sign saying that with this hand dripping blood coming down from above. And I was thinking over this week, is that really a self-portrait? And I thought, well, actually it is, because it's really holding a lot of grief and upset from me. So I'm just in case anybody finds this useful as a tip, if you use any kind of white background in digital photography and turn up the contrast, you can pretty much make it look like it's been shot in a studio. But in fact, that is me literally sitting on a windowsill outside of a cottage. So the hand is much bigger than I am, which again, I think is very much kind of, yes, just looking at the power of institutions over our lives. So the hand is coming down from the left, dripping blood. And I'm sort of just sitting there at the bottom in a black t-shirt and black, well, they probably wouldn't have been black sunglasses. They would have been black glasses that had gone black because I was sitting on the windowsill in the bright sunshine. But it's just please do not touch the artwork. Um, so let me take that off. Alison and I talked about this beforehand, and we were looking at the difference between autobiographical work and self-portrait work. So I've also done quite a bit of autobiographical work because I think within disability arts in general, as an international art movement, lived experience is really important. So there's work that's autobiographical, that's not self-portraiture. What I'm not sure about is how much the next ones are autobiographical, how much they're land art, and how much they're self-portraiture, but they've got self-portrait elements. And it's a series that I did between about 2005 and about 2009 at Holton Lee in Dorset. And I was artist in residence at the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive, which then was based in Dorset. And land art is something that I've always been very interested in. The body and landscape, or landscape and the body, really appeals to me. But I like to make work that leaves no trace. So for those of you who are familiar with land art, people in the past, Richard Long, who I'm a huge fan of, but carrying stones and putting them into circles is these days is quite frowned upon. Andy Goldsworthy chucking pigment into waterfalls. Again, we don't do that now, or at least we try not to. So I'm always interested in making work without leaving a trace. So these are basically my shadow across these different environments at Holton Lee at different times. So I'm just going to. So just very, very briefly, I mean, again, all of these have got, I think all of them have got a stick in, but this is my shadow cast across a very sort of muddy, marshy piece of ground. It's got a very green background. The shadow's very blue. I will have manipulated that at some point in Photoshop. Now there's a shadow over, I think effectively the sort of under the trees in the woods. So you can see the leaves and the shadows of other trees. You know, there's some green leaves, but mostly it's very brown. This is a shadow. All the shadows are very similar. This is over heather. I think one thing I would say with the shadows is the head gets smaller and smaller and the feet are bigger and bigger because of course the shadow falls away from you as you're holding the camera. This is one against very, very bright green grass, so I suspect probably sort of height of the summer. And this is another very bright green one, but lots of plant life underneath rather than grass. And I think this is the last one. This is over a puddle. So it's very, very sort of a muddy brown. And each time you can see my hand almost saluting because, of course, it's holding the camera. So self-portraits, land art, autobiography. Fortunately, I'm not an art critic, so I don't have to worry about it. So I've just got a couple of more up-to-date things to show you, and then we will have time just to take some points. So Platinum Jubilee, I put in, I think, the 2023 Together 2012 Open Exhibition. And it's, let me do some audio description first. So in this image, I'm sitting, in fact, in the chair. You can't see it, but I'm sitting in the same chair now. And it's an antique wheeled chair, so which I upcycled with a PA. It was actually bought by my partner, but eventually she's still not quite sure how it came into my possession instead, but there you are. So we replaced the broken basket work with blue electrical cables. So it looks like I'm sitting on net, but it's actually blue electrical cable mesh. It's it's a lovely chair, really. It's silver and it has a sort of very small wheel at the back. I'm wearing a long sleeve black top with a different decorated brace. You know, this was a brace that was decorated by Andrew Logan that I wore in a piece in 2001 that again toured nationally as part of a touring exhibition and has been all over the place. But I hadn't worn it for a long time, but I wanted to get it out. I'm wearing a green carnival king hat with very sort of big feathers at the top, big green ostrich feathers. And that was made by Para Carnival and gifted to me. And then I'm holding a purple walking stick, which was just a wooden walking stick that I took some coloured rubbing wax to. I've also got silver crushed velvet trousers on, and I've got a sort of silver crushed velvet curtains hanging in the background. So I've tried to make the whole of the background a sort of silver crushed purple and to fade into it a little bit in terms of my legs. And I've got black plastic glasses on, very similar to the ones I've got on now. Now, I made that the weekend of the Jubilee in June 2022. But I only realised this, and as far as I was concerned, it was me responding to the Jubilee, but I only realised this week that in fact I was 60 a few weeks beforehand. And that was really my official portrait for my 60th birthday. I've been shielding since 2020, so I haven't been out since 2020. So my birthday parties always take place on Zoom. So there'd been no 60th birthday party. And any waving at friends was very much I thought I was doing a regal wave in the image, but I think really it was also reflecting that kind of all you can do is wave through the window at somebody who's kind of out there in the car. And there's this, I think, a sense of restriction. I looked at the chair and I thought, oh, it was very throne-like, but also it's actually very restrictive. It's not a chair that you could ever move yourself. It's a chair that somebody pushes. And it was quite reminiscent, which is why I used it, of the sort of, oh, I can't remember the name, but the stand chairs that people carry. And of course, royalty is carried in a sedan chair. But again, it's not independent. So although it's quite a glamorous photograph in its way, it's got these, things from my past, the times that I used to go out with Para Carnival, the times that I used to go out perhaps to Andrew Logan's club nights and things, or just go clubbing anyway, the times that I'd worked. So yeah, I think for me, what I'm beginning to realize is it's a more complicated image than I thought it was. And I'm just going to finish very briefly with two more traditional selfies. One that I took in London in front of the Together banner. I'll audio describe them in a minute, and one more recently. And I just wanted to underline that there isn't this kind of divide between, oh, this is the self-portrait and this is the selfie. Really, it's all the same thing. If you're photographing yourself, you're creating a self-portrait. So in this one, it's a Head and Shoulders. I've got a purple trilby, a purple silk shirt, and a sort of multicolored with purple silk scarf around me, black plastic framed glasses, and you can see a bit of the Together graffiti banner behind. And then in this one, I've got a purple t-shirt. It's much more relaxed. I've got some blue and white starry curtains behind me, which I'm sure some of you will recognize from other Zooms that we do. I've got a telescope. I've got a baseball cap. You can see that it's daylight. And I think the contrast, that's, if you like, that's me kind of coming into contact with the outside, quite literally for the first time in some years, because at the point, yes, when I took that photograph, I hadn't been out for 26 months. So, literally outside, I'd only been into the backyard, but I hadn't been further than our dustbin for 26 months. And, same there. Whereas they're, you know, looking slightly tired, I have to say, but this is me outside being able to really see a much longer way. So if I ask Alison to join me, if you switch your camera on, Alison, oh great, and then Marcy's.
Yeah.
So I'm just skidding through. So there's some lovely points, people. Thank you. Julie says she's got a series of questions to ask. Would you mind, Marcy, just voice overing Julie's questions, or at least the first one? And then I'll come on to talk to Alison.
Yeah, is so just the questions.
Just the first question.
Yeah.
Something about practicing, but I can't quite read it.
Oh yes. It says that first image is impressive for a number of reasons, but I'm impressed at your depth of field. Did you have to practice a lot to be able to achieve that?
Oh, and could you just read the rest of that one?
Yeah. What advice would you give to someone new to photography to help them to get that sharpness?
Well, it's interesting. I don't think any of my photography is that sharp, and I'm never bothered because actually I don't have great eyesight. So I always want, I don't see things incredibly sharply, and I never have done. Um, but I do think it's important to understand that nothing ever goes right first time. I had to get my Falmouth shoot right first time because I'd got, the studio, the cameras, the lights. It was all very much a kind of one-off occasion. When I shot the abnormal one, I think I did a whole weekend on it and then went through it in the week and then did another whole weekend on it. So I think often people think, oh, I've tried and it wasn't any good. I can't be any good, but it just takes time. I really rarely ever make something that I don't have to remake or want to remake because I can see how I can improve it. So I think it's practice and not giving up and just understanding that it's part of the process not to get it right straight away. Because I think so often, particularly as women, and particularly as disabled people and as disabled women, we just think, oh, we can't do it because it's not brilliant. But also, if you'd seen some of those images before I started photoshopping them, I always think if you can get a strong image, everything else can be manipulated. You can make it look like it was photographed in a studio by adjusting the contrast. You can play with the color, you can play with the light, so focus on the image, but I wouldn't actually worry about how tightly kind of, yeah, how sharply contrasted it is. Alison, I know you've got some beautiful questions to read out, but have you got anything that was more spontaneous?
Yeah, I was really impressed with Brace in my not so secret life as a cyborg, and the way you took something that would be traditionally hidden and put it in view and adapted it. Um, I thought that was really strong, actually, a sort of image of pride in disability.
Yes, and I still look back and think I'm not quite sure how I had the courage to do it, but I think it was just that I think if I hadn't had my friend Joe to help me decorate it, because I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I don't think I would have had any of the practical skills to do it myself. But yes, I think what there was it was very much a kind of once I'd done it, there was no going back.
Mm.
And I did find the kind of sitting down at a table and having my colleagues move, literally move their lunches and go and sit somewhere else a little bit difficult. Petra Coopers, who some of you will know, was doing a PhD at Falmouth at the time, and I met her, and she ran into me almost and said, "Oh, it's a spinal brace. You're doing it just like Frida Kahlo." And I thought, "Thank you." I hadn't actually, although I knew who Frida Kahlo was, I hadn't seen Frida Kahlo's brace images. So that sent me off onto a whole other kind of journey. But yes, Petra was a real kind of great voice there. And it was Petra who then, because I ended up presenting this work all over the place, including, I think, in Aberystwyth at the Performance Studies International Conference, which again, Petra introduced me to. So Petra was a great kind of one woman kind of publicity machine for it. But she was the sole person at Falmouth who really got it, as another disabled woman and as another artist. So it was hard, but I think, yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people our age, it has been hard. There's not a reason not to do it. But it is, I think it's probably only now that I can look back and go, actually, yeah, that was really tough.
And with perception 1 to 4, what made you use light boxes for the piece?
Well, that's a really interesting question because I can't quite remember. But I think, but yeah, I really can't remember. But I think to me, it was about using Photoshop can be like sculpting with light.
Mm.
And in the same way that Matisse had taken this one cast and then reworked it was about taking one image and being able to rework it. And what I tend to do with my very coloured images, which look like they've been filtered, is I take what they call the curves in Photoshop. So you're literally hand play, you're playing with these kind of representations of the light in the image. So I think it might have been to do with that. Plus, there is a lovely glow to them, and those have been ironically, they were commissioned as part of this fund called Innovate that the Arts Council ran. And as
Yeah,
part of Innovate, they were shown at Sadler's Wells. Then I had a solo exhibition at Oval House Theatre in South London, and they had a cafe gallery. So they went in the cafe gallery, and I realised to my horror, because of course, it's one thing to devise these things on a relatively small screen, and it's quite another to see yourself nude, kind of four of you, 2 meters high, and apparently you could see it from the buses going past the Oval. So that was a bit of a shock. Then it got lost in storage. I put it into professional art storage, and as with Tracy Emin and Damien Hirst and everybody else, art storage was not what we thought it was going to be. But it was commissioned and remade for Dada Fest in about 2008, 2009. And then they had two each either side of the Blue Coat Gallery. And that edition went to the View Tube outside the Olympic Park in the sort of early days of the Olympic Park. And then most recently, my storage unit was at Trinity Buoy Wharf on the river. And we put it up, well, they put it up for me on the river because it has that rainbow effect. So during the sort of, I think it was the winter of 2021, I said to them, well, should we just do this? It is, the rainbows for COVID and for the NHS. So really the last time it was seen was for the NHS. We've just got time. I'm really appreciating all of these comments, but I think I'll just come back to you for a final question, Alison.
Yeah, I mean, abnormal towards a scientific model of disability was your major show. Why was it found offensive?
I th I've always argued for the right for our lives as disabled people to be perceived as valuable as any other. And
Mm.
unfortunately, it was an institution which had a considerable amount of work dedicated to making sure that people with genetic disorders don't exist. And I'm somebody with multiple genetic disorders. So, yes, I just think in retrospect, they should never have taken it. I think, not every show is going to be suitable for every venue, but unfortunately, as the artist, you're really dependent on the venue operators to make the right choice. Everything was available on the website because everything I do, I make a web version of. So yes, I think it was just very unfortunate, should we say.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that would happen in this day and age, because it was
I
a.
think in this day and age, they'd be less likely to take it in the first place.
Oh, okay.
And yes, I don't look back on these sort of almost 30 years of creating self-portraits and think that things have necessarily moved forward rather than backwards. But I would just like to finish by, and the hours sort of rushed by, but so thank you for everybody who put things into the chat. I'm going to look at that later, and thank you for questions that you've prepared, Alison, that you've not had a chance to ask. But just to encourage everybody, you don't have to define yourself as an artist, let alone as a professional artist, to create a self-portrait. We would love to see your self-portraits for the Reflecting Ourselves exhibition. We guarantee that as long as it meets our safer spaces policy, your work will be included. So yes, I really encourage you. And I just can't wait to see everybody else's self-portraits. So I would like to thank, of course, Chris Burrow from Burrow Interpreting for the British Sign Language interpretation, Norman McKay, our captioner from Global Real-Time Captioning, the wonderful Together 2012 team with Alison in front of the camera and everybody else behind. And of course, most of all, everybody who's attended and everybody who's watching it on the recording. So thank you all again. My website is ju90, ju90.co.uk. So if you want to see more of the work, it's all on there, and there are links to those sites on the web page for the exhibition and for the workshop. You can click directly through. I'm always happy to hear from people by email. So again, if you want to email me, I'm ju@together2012.org.uk. So it's exactly 4 o'clock. So I will say thank you all again and goodbye.